Hi. This video is the fifth one in a series intended to introduce beginners to the philosophy of existentialism. In this video, I'd like to situate existentialism's primary thinkers and texts within its overall timeline. The purpose of doing this is to help you understand the general movement of existential thought and to provide a measure of organization to what would otherwise be a pretty diverse and disorienting bricolage of thinkers, texts, and ideas. I'll be organizing the material in this video first in terms of 19th century thinkers, then we'll map out the terrain of 20th century existentialism in terms of three rough and approximate categories. First, the existential phenomenological thinkers. Second, existentialists whose work is philosophical in nature, but not existential phenomenological in the strictest sense. And finally, existentialists whose works are more toward the literary end of the spectrum. Along the way, I'll also be making note of some of their most famous texts, and since this video is intended as an introduction to existentialism, I'll also suggest a good first contact book for each thinker, and then give you a general idea of how difficult it is to read and understand his or her work. Of course, gauging the difficulty of each thinker is bound to be a highly subjective thing, and your appraisal might not be the same as mine. But I think it might prove useful to you nonetheless, especially if you're a beginner to all this. Anyhow, here's the very subjective scale I'll be using to gauge each author's average difficulty. Cake, easy, medium, hard, very hard, and then brutal. Okay, so let's dig into the 19th century existentialists. Maybe the first thing you should know about the 19th century existentialists is that none of them is explicitly doing phenomenology, at least not phenomenology in its formal technical sense. That's because the forms of existentialism that explicitly operate phenomenologically emerged in the 20th century. And by the way, if you want to know more about phenomenology, you can watch my video entitled Edmund Husserl and the Adventure of Phenomenology. I'll put a link to that in the description for this video, along with links to a batch of other videos I've done about specific existentialists. Anyhow, if you've watched the previous videos in this series, you're probably already aware that existentialism proper began with the early mid-19th century Danish thinker Søren Kierkegaard, who in part was responding to George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel's idea of Geist, which is to say, his way of conceiving of history as a dialectical process. So let's begin our timeline for existentialism there. And let's localize it more specifically in terms of some of Kierkegaard's more notable works, among which I would include Either Or, published in 1843, The Concept of Dread, variously translated as The Concept of Anxiety, published in 1844, The Concluding Unscientific Postscript to the Philosophical Fragments, 1846, and The Sickness unto Death, 1849. Personally, I think that the most psychologically interesting of these would be The Concept of Dread, which I'd recommend as an entry point into reading Kierkegaard. However, I'd also say that his average difficulty is in the hard to very hard range, partly because of his frequent use of devices like sarcasm, parody, pseudonyms, sophisticated jokes, etc. This sometimes makes it difficult to tell whether he's articulating his own position or sarcastically parodying someone else. A particularly infamous example of this occurs in the beginning of The Sickness unto Death, so watch out for that if you start with that book. Okay, let's move forward a couple of decades where we encounter the Russian Fyodor Dostoyevski, whose most famous existential work is probably the very short book Notes from the Underground, 1864. I would highly recommend this book to beginners. Unlike Kierkegaard's books, it's easy to read, short, and accessible. Plus, there are free digital versions of it out there. However, I would say that while it's an easy book to read, his principal arguments are deceptively deep and powerful and, well, somewhat unnerving if you take the time to think about them. In other words, it's easy to get the sense that you know what he's saying when you really don't. A phenomenon that occurs in existential writings with some frequency, so a little warning there. Okay, let's move forward a couple of decades more, where we encounter the German philosopher and erstwhile philologist Friedrich Nietzsche. Probably the first thing to note about Nietzsche is that some people regard him as more of a proto-post-structuralist or proto-postmodernist than an existentialist proper, partly because of the way the will to power deviates from the usual existential way of thinking about freedom, and partly because of his profound influence on Michel Foucault in the later 20th century. However, there are still strong existential threads to be found in Nietzsche's work, so let's include him here. His most famous work is undoubtedly his Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which was published in several parts between 1883 and 1891. All in all, Zarathustra isn't a bad point into Nietzsche's work. I would say that it's cake to read, but actually hard to understand. Part of that's because Zarathustra is mostly an allegorical presentation of many of Nietzsche's ideas, so the reader is inevitably left with the not-so-easy task of extracting the message out of the dense symbolism. Another thing to say about Zarathustra is that in terms of style, it's not very representative of Nietzsche's oeuvre, large portions of which are cast in terms of numerous pithy epigrams and provocative pronouncements. Personally, I think that the collection entitled The Portable Nietzsche is the single best entry point into his work, first because it contains the entirety of Zarathustra as well as the more aphoristic Twilight of the Idols. So you get two good solid examples of those styles of presentation. In addition, it contains many great excerpts from other famous works, such as The Gay Science and Beyond Good and Evil, as well as a few chaotic letters from the period of Nietzsche's madness. All in all, I would say that reading Nietzsche is a little like playing chess. Easy to do, but hard to master. You might also be forewarned that it's extremely easy to misunderstand Nietzsche, almost notoriously so. However, as you might be able to infer from my videos, I think that Nietzsche is definitely one of the most exciting, provocative, and prescient thinkers, well, ever. And as he also had the decency to die in the year 1900, this brings us into the 20th century. Okay, so in the 20th century, we see the advent of a new and very technical form of existentialism known as existential phenomenology. Basically, existential phenomenology grew out of the movement of pure phenomenology, which came out of Edmund Husserl's work in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And its first exponent was Husserl's erstwhile student, Martin Heidegger. Heidegger's most famous work is undoubtedly Being and Time, which was published in 1927. Basically, existential phenomenology is about systematically reflecting upon and interpreting everyday experience in order to reveal its underlying meaning and structure, especially with respect to the question of existence or being. Heidegger's treatment of it in Being and Time is definitely dense, demanding, and not for the faint of heart. It contains many tricky technical coinages that themselves demand a fair amount of work to grasp. I would say that it's mostly in the very hard range, especially if you're not used to reading texts in existential phenomenology. However, once you get used to Heidegger's fundamental project and linguistic peculiarities, it gets considerably easier with time. As for Being in Time, there are two English translations of it. I personally have a slight preference for the older one by Macquarie and Robinson, but the one by Joan Stambaugh is pretty good too. However, probably the gentlest entry point into Heidegger is the popular collection entitled Basic Writings, which contains the first two introductions to Being in Time, as well as a healthy selection from his later writings. All in all, I would say that Heidegger ranges between hard and very hard, with occasional forays into the brutal range. However, it should probably also be noted that in his time, Heidegger did not identify with the movement of existentialism. He saw his project more specifically in terms of phenomenological ontology, and so his placement among the existentialists remains subject to some dispute. However, such was definitely not the case with Jean-Paul Sartre. His most famous work, also in the vein of existential phenomenology, was Being and Nothingness, which was published in 1943. However, he also gained a lot of renown for expressing his ideas in the artistic form of novels and plays, such as Nausea and No Exit. Like pretty much all of the major works in existential phenomenology, Being and Nothingness is pretty much in the hard range. Sorry, but existential phenomenology doesn't get much easier than that. However, I find that the very first section of Being and Nothingness is in the very hard range, so I usually recommend to my students that they skip it and then come back to it later. However, I would say that a much more accessible treatment of many of Sartre's ideas resides in his short 1946 work entitled Existentialism is a Humanism, which I would say is in the easy range. This 70-page work is contained in the book that I think is the single best entry point into Sartre, a book entitled Essays in Existentialism, which also contains his 1939 work, The Emotions, Outline of a Theory. And while we're talking about Sartre, we should probably also mention his intellectual comrade and lover, Simone de Beauvoir. Her most famous contribution to existentialism is probably the treatment of existential ethics to be found in her relatively short 1947 work entitled The Ethics of Ambiguity, which I would say is in the easy to medium range of difficulty. It basically proceeds upon the basis of Sartre's treatment of freedom and responsibility and draws out its ethical implications. Of course, Sartre himself wrote at some length about the ethical dimensions of his existential insights, but I personally find de Beauvoir's treatment to be much more comprehensive, convincing, and exciting, and completely at peace with Sartre's earlier work. And this brings us to another famous existential phenomenologist and a contemporary of Sartre and de Beauvoir, Maurice Merleau-Ponty. His most famous work is his 1945 treatise entitled The Phenomenology of Perception, which I would say is the single best phenomenological treatment of embodiment. However, here again, his work is probably fairly daunting for the beginner, ranging between hard and very hard in my estimation. In my view, a much more brief and accessible entry point into his work would be the collection of essays entitled The Primacy of Perception, which would probably range between medium and hard. Okay, now that we've traced the primary contours of existential phenomenology in the 20th century, let's turn our attention to some 20th century existential thinkers whose work is still fairly technically philosophical, but not necessarily phenomenological in the strictest sense of the word. However, before doing this, we should probably acknowledge that even the most artistic and literary forms of existentialism can still be theoretically regarded as a type of phenomenological inquiry. So the distinction between phenomenological and non-phenomenological types of existentialism is probably only rough and approximate. Anyhow, among these thinkers, the one who is probably closest to technical phenomenology was Karl Jaspers, especially in his most famous work entitled simply Philosophy. However, Jaspers himself casts his project in terms of what he calls peri-ekontology, rather than in terms of phenomenology. In turn, peri-ekontology is an etymological rendering of one of his principal ways of describing being, which he calls encompassing. Obviously, Jaspers was intent on inventing his own unique type of inquiry into being. However, many of the same themes and language that appear in Heidegger's Being and Time also appear in Jaspers' philosophy, although sometimes with variation in their actual meaning. All in all, Jaspers' treatment of being in terms of encompassing is definitely more technical than existentialism in its more literary forms typically is. However, I would say that Jaspers' writing is somewhat more accessible than Heidegger, and so I would rate it in the medium to hard range. Another existential thinker whose work is fairly technically philosophical and yet not phenomenological in the strictest sense would be Gabriel Marcel. Probably his most famous work was the 1950 3-volume set of compiled lectures entitled The Mystery of Being. Like Kierkegaard before him, Marcel approaches existentialism from the perspective of Christian theism, a theme that appears in his work with varying degrees of emphasis. All in all, I would place Marcel's writing in the medium range of difficulty. And while we're on the topic of theistic existentialism, we should probably mention Paul Tillich, who wrote during the same period as Marcel. Probably Tillich's most famous work would be The Courage to Be, published in 1952. While I would say that the bulk of The Courage to Be isn't particularly theistic in character, the final section of the book, which is on courage and transcendence, definitely is. Here we find Tillich's famous contention that the courage to be is rooted in the God who appears when God has disappeared in the anxiety of doubt. Anyhow, all in all, I'd say that Tillich's work is in the easy to medium range, perhaps partly because he's one of the few existentialists who lived a large fraction of his life in the United States, a culture that tends to place a great premium on direct and accessible writing. And this brings us to a range of existential thinkers whose work is more toward the artistic, literary end of the spectrum, but literary expression that almost always contains some measure of philosophical import. The earliest of these in the 20th century would probably be the Spanish thinker Miguel de Unamuno, especially with the publication of his 1912 work, The Tragic Sense of Life. Sometimes existential writers adopt a quasi-poetic, almost oracular style, and such is the case with The Tragic Sense of Life. That's mostly because these authors aim at evoking an actual first-hand experience rather than merely informing the reader or positing an intellectualized argument. Consequently, these works tend to be in the easy range to read, but demand a certain poetic sensibility and receptivity on the part of the reader. So, generally, these sorts of works appeal to readers who are so inclined, but befuddle and repel those who insist on a more rigorously methodical and systematic approach. This would also be the case with Martin Buber's famous little book, I and Thou, which was published in 1923. I and Thou is once again very theistic in its approach, although this time from a Judaic perspective. And once again, it's written in a poetic, almost rhapsodic style, which is bound to appeal to some readers and repel others. All in all, I'd say that I and Thou is in the easy range for anyone who possesses a reasonably poetic sensibility, but medium or hard for people that don't. But of course, other forms of existential literature are written in a more straightforward, prosaic style. Such would be the case with the Czech-Austrian Franz Kafka, who produced a trio of famous novels entitled The Metamorphosis, The Trial, and The Castle, which were published in 1915, 1925, and 1926, respectively. Perhaps more than any other existential author, Kafka graphically illustrates the dynamics of alienation, anxiety, and absurdity that have attended the modern industrial bureaucratic era. Consequently, his books tend to be easy to read, but actually somewhat more difficult to get through at a visceral, emotional level. And finally, let's end our brief tour of the terrain of existentialism with the French-Algerian Albert Camus, who produced a range of fairly famous existential novels, which would include The Stranger, The Fall, and The Plague, all of which I'd recommend. They're cake to read. However, deriving their philosophical import is considerably more difficult, again, mostly because of their symbolic and allegorical nature. Consequently, I usually recommend another work as the best entry point for beginners, The Myth of Sisyphus and Other Essays. I would say that this work is a little harder to read, basically in the medium range of difficulty, but is written in a fairly direct rather than symbolic way. Consequently, it's a much easier and certainly a much more direct access point than his novels are. Okay, so wow, that was a whole lot of names, dates, and titles. But hopefully it served to organize some of the broad and varied terrain of existentialism. Hopefully I remembered to include your favorites, but if not, well, my apologies. Anyhow, in our next video, we'll look at the historical transition from existentialism to structuralism, which ultimately heralded the advent of post-structuralism, deconstructionism, and postmodernism with continental thought. Until then, take care of your soul. Peace out.